Good morning and welcome to the Saturday special of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Code. Recently, in the last couple of days, India is seeing a lot of disturbance. There are protests galore in over about a dozen odd countries or maybe more than that. People have lost their lives. And then there's almost universal says limited to the Muslim world, Middle East and Iran, Malaysia, who have been, and Indonesia, who have been objecting to a statement by the two BJP functionaries who are no longer BJP functionaries. But the recent disturbance, which is social political, is symptomatic of the passion and is absolutely deprived from reason and logic. I fully agree that nobody has a right to criticize a religious leader, but to question and to ask questions is a part of spirit of inquiry that permeates the modern civilization. As for the attitude and the anger of Middle Eastern countries is concerned, it's in fact nothing but a wanton intrusion and interference in the internal affairs, the domestic issues of another country. Muslims in India are first Indians and then Muslims. Let's be very clear. The nation state is a negation of the religious state. Ummah, as is perceived and promoted by OIC and others, is a 14th century concept and must not be applicable. I know people are misled by unreasonableness, passions reign supreme. But then I was rereading Quran, and I found that all these protests, both by the local people, of course, common people are not involved in that, but the people who are provoked, people who are misled, even leading to the losing their own lives. So passionate are they. But all these protests and this hue and cry, all the din created is anti-Muslim in nature, anti-Islamic, un-Islamic as I call it. In Islam, if these Maulanas and the religious leaders who are at the drop of a hat issue fatwas, why don't they tell their followers that blasphemy is a subject of intellectual discussion according to the Muslim hadiths? It's not condemnation, it's not protest, it's not retaliation. All these aspects of protest, condemnation, protest, and retaliation are not a part of intellectual discussion, which is a hallmark of Islam. As a matter of fact, the discussions of Islamic, and especially in the Cairo University, have been of such a high intellectual order. And there are verses galore in Quran that show that the abuse of Prophet is not the subject of punishment. Instead, sound arguments should be presented to address the mind of the critic. You remember Charles Thibault's cartoons in France that caused an international upheaval. But at that time, the countries, the Middle East, did not criticize France. They criticized the person. Here, they are criticizing the government. And these BJP functionaries, even though one was a spokesperson of BJP, they are not government functionaries. We have got to draw a line. India is not China or Russia, where party is supreme. No way. Here, the party and the government are two different things. Now, according to Quran, God sent more than 1 lakh prophets to different regions. The contemporaries almost responded negatively by using abusive language. Their contemporaries, each prophet in his own time, was condemned, criticized. Guru Nanak was called Kuraya, misled. And this is in Quran, verse 36 30, and verse 16 101, and verse 7 66. So, in three verses, Quran states that these 1 lakh prophets sent at different times to different places were condemned by their contemporaries. But they were then persuaded to believe the truth by discussions. In Sikh religion, the Siddh Goshtis of Guru Nanak are very, very famous. So is in Islam. And nowhere in Quran it says or prescribes physical punishment for the people who criticize Muhammad, the Prophet. Rather, the Quran commands the Prophet to refrain from using abusive language in retaliation. And Quran ayat, the verse 6-108, very clear about that. But do not revile those who invoke instead of God, lest they in their hostility revile God out of ignorance. So they consider that the people who condemn Prophet or God are ignorant. But ignorant are not to be punished, not to be condemned, they are to be educated. And the way of education is not protest, it's not killing, it's not slaughter, it is arguments, discussions. So this should have been resolved by discussions. Now, incidents that are termed today as an insult and abuse of Prophet was prevalent during the life of Prophet himself. You remember when Prophet Muhammad presented his message before the Arabs, how did they behave with him? They misbehaved with him badly. And here are some of the epithets given to the Prophet, and it's again mentioned in Quran. These people who condemned Hazrat Muhammad called him a liar. And this is verse 40.24. They call him possessed. Verse 15.6. A fabricator, a cheat. 16.101. And a foolish man, 7-66. But you read the whole of Quran from the beginning to the end, and you would not find a single reference that any one of them, or the Prophet himself, prescribed any physical punishment for these offenses. So when they say prosecute these, okay, because the law of land has changed, prosecute them. But that doesn't call for protest. That doesn't call for killing of the innocent people. So these verses clearly show that the abuse of Prophet is not a subject of condemnation or for seeking punishment. As a matter of fact, if they are really Islamic in nature, they would say, okay, Nupur and Jinder, let's sit down and talk about it. Let's have a TV debate on that. So rather than seeking punishment and the prosecution, these Muslim Protestants should take it as a subject of removal of the misunderstanding through sound argument in order to adjust their minds. Change of mind is what is prescribed by the Quran. Not at the end of a gun, but the force of your arguments. In other words, what Quran prescribes is peaceful persuasion, which should be used to help the person understand the truth in a matter rather than trying to punish him. So whatever the protests are taking are un-Islamic. In fact, they are insulting Prophet Muhammad by disobeying his advice, his order, his dictates. This is clearly, if you study Quran and the Hadith, there's ample evidence that tells you what to do in such a case. And these are there in the Quran, these are there in the Hadith, and they actually tell how to deal with such situation. For example, when the Prophet was in Mecca, a man came to him and told him that, and he was face to face, O Muhammad Abinai. And this means, O Muhammad, you are a condemned person. No, Muhammad didn't slap him. He didn't order his followers to kill him. The Prophet smiled. And this smile was a moral response and was bound to hit the conscience of the person who had called him a condemned person. So the man fell into introspection and took on no time in accepting Muhammad as his prophet and became one of his followers. It's very interesting to note that the response of Muhammad and his companion on such occasions, they never indulged in aggressive activities against non-Muslims. Instead, they prayed for them and tried to remove their misconceptions by discussions, adopting a peaceful method, and in fact, meeting all the requirements of scientific inquiry. And it's old times, ancient times. People generally gave expression to their thoughts in poetry. And that's what the opponents of Muhammad did. The opponents of Prophet Muhammad used to recite abusive couplets directed at him. And in order to counter such couplets and poems, the Prophet then asked one of his followers, Hassan ibn Thabit. And Hassan ibn Thabit is called by Encyclopedia Britannica poetic defender. So it was his job to counter literary attacks on him in the form of couplets. As a matter of fact, Hassan was the first religious poet of Islam. And you would find many such incidents in the life of Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet peacefully countered arguments with arguments. He attempted to satisfy the other party at an intellectual level, not at the street shouting. With these examples of the Prophet and his companions, can all this violence, all this protest, all this hullabaloo, all this noise be justified? No. Muslims must know that as peaceful followers of a religion which means peace, Islam means peace. They must deal with such cases by reasoned arguments rather than seek to mete out punishment. They are not for revenge, they are for rectification. And all Islamic teachings, if you really go by, are based on reason and argument. As per the Islamic injunction, if a person commits blasphemy, the responsibility of Muslim is to meet with a concerned person, try to remove his misunderstanding by peaceful means. And if they fail to do their job in convincing him, then according to Muhammad's teaching, they are left only with one option, that is to pray for him in all sincerity. So first is to persuade him, to convince him, and if the person is not convinced, obdurate, then pray that sense dawns on him. Open the eyes of knowledge. Let God's mercy be on him so that man can understand that abuse is of no purpose and he should see the light of the day. Now, when I see this, when I see that Jesus himself had pardoned his killers, the crucifiers, I do not find any justification. either for the rage and anger of the Islamic states in Middle East, or these street protests in India leading to unnecessary deaths. As a matter of fact, the whole charade, the whole series of protests is in fact un-Islamic, and it is shocking that not a single ulama has come forward to condemn them. Yes, one has. Bukhari, the head imam of Jama Masjid Delhi, had the courage to say that these protests are not justified. Even if the cause is there, the way the protests are being conducted are un-Islamic, and the sooner they stop vitiating the geospatial and social climate of the country, the better it would be. In fact, such protests are an example of ignorance, ignorance of Islam, and the sooner sense dawns on them, the protesters, and they adopt the way of discussion, debate, logical thinking, presentation, the problem would be solved. And it's incumbent both the parties not to lose a cool, but to sit across the table and talk it out. That is the Islamic way, not going to the streets, killing people, throwing stones, destroying property. That is un-Islamic as well as antisocial. Think about it. Thank you.